Hi, Kriegsspielers. It's Umpire LaFondiose, and it's time to talk about visiting a battlefield LaFondiose style. Now, when I say that, it makes it sound like something in my style of visiting a battlefield is superior to others, and that's absolutely not the case. The point is that we all have our interests, we all have our approaches, and this is just some lessons that I've learned in visiting battlefields over many, many years. And what I want you to do is to learn from my mistakes so that any visit to a battlefield is a profitable and well-earned addition to your Kriegsspiel umpiring and playing skills. I'm going to show you a picture of myself at Gettysburg in 2017. And you can see here the first mistake that I made was this haircut. Now, the kids, the lesson to learn here is when you're in your barber's chair, don't tell an engaging and funny story because the barber gets distracted and he cuts all your hair off and you end up looking like that. So that's the mistake I made. But here's something that I learned from this trip in 2017. I was there on a tour. I went to all the normal places that you would go in Gettysburg. I went to Little Round Top, where Sickles pushed out too far, even walked Pickett's Charge. This statue is a statue of George Sears Green, and I was told before the visit by my mother that George Sears Green was in the matrilineal line of our family. In fact, not a direct descendant, but in the same family tree. And so I have a copy of that family tree. And when I went there for this trip, before the tour began, I said, I'm going to go find where George Sears Green defended Culp's Hill on behalf of the Union and made that hill impracticable for Ewell to attack because George Sears Green was an engineer and he set up all sorts of works on that hill to make it a very tough nut to crack. So this is the one picture that I have from that trip. All the famous places that I went to, it wasn't my first trip to Gettysburg, but all the famous places I went to were absolutely outshone by this one point of personal interest. And so here's tip number one when you visit a battlefield: create points of personal interest. George Sears Green being in my family line made it a very interesting thing. I remember it. And of course, if you look at the picture, you can see immediately the family resemblance. So what I did for my trip to Königgrätz is I actually began to read up on the battle ahead of time because you can't pick up points of personal interest if you don't know about the battle. So another piece of advice I would give you is find something very accessible that you enjoy reading and read up on the battle. So I chose this book, which was Gordon Craig's Battle of Königgrätz, published in 1966. And the reason I love it is that his writing is superb. His descriptions, his use of language, it feels a little outdated for today, but that actually adds to its charm. So I read this book. I've read through this book a couple of times, and I refer to it. This book became my touchstone. There's also an additional book by Quentin Berry and several other pieces of information that I used as well. But this was my primary source for studying this battle. And then what I did is I used Kriegsspiel skills. So I immediately turned and I mapped the battle out. So here is a map that I made of the Königgrätz battlefield with the Prussian and the Austrian lines. This is the entire Gordon Craig book captured in one slide or one image. And what you see here is the Prussian line creates a fishhook, and the Austrian line has what looks like interior lines, and this was the source of the Prussian attack. This was over the course of one day. This was an entire book's worth of reading, but this is one slide that maps out the battlefield. So I did this before I even went to Königgrätz. I had to make arrangements to get there. So transportation is really important, and here's why. If you go on a tour bus, you're going to be shuttled around the location, and you're going to be, you're going to have a couple minutes per stop, and you're going to be given a bit of information about that. But you don't have to worry about driving. So there's a cost benefit there. And the tour bus will take its route, usually a route that's better for the bus driver, not necessarily for you studying the battlefield. So you want to take into account how you go approach the battlefield, because all battlefields are usually too large to walk. So you're going to want to take some sort of conveyance. If you drive yourself, you have the difficulty of actually creating the transportation and navigating. So one of the first battlefields I ever visited was the location over the U.S. cavalry tracked down an Apache band in Arizona, and I had to find it. So I spent most of the day finding it and spent maybe 20 minutes at the site. And there was one little sign there, but at least I found it, and it was part of my canon for another video. When you pick out your transportation. You want to figure out how you want to approach the battlefield. In this case, I found out that from Prague to the battlefield site was about an hour and 11 minutes. I did not have an international driver's license, which was an error on my part, but I wanted to take the time to go there. So I hired a driver to take me out there. What I then did was took advantage and researched what was available for tourists because it's a famous battlefield. There are going to be certain aids, there's going to be museums, there's going to be different things that a battlefield is going to have. So there's a visitor center. You don't want to have the visitor center be the sole source of your information, but you want to take advantage of it. So I actually called the museum curator and talked to him for a few minutes about local resources. Fortunately, the museum was closed at this time. It's been closed for renovation until 2026, but at least I reached out and figured out what was going on there. And here's me standing in front of the museum at the Königgrätz battlefield. I look forward to going back and seeing it once it opens because it has a terrific, from the pictures, it looks like it has a terrific amount of additional information. My focus on this trip was to get out and see the battlefield, so it's fine that I didn't spend any time inside. Here was the lodestone, here's the keystone, here's the map, here's the plan. So what I did was I picked a half a dozen places on the battlefield from stories that I had heard. These were anecdotes from Gordon Craig's book where I wanted to see that spot. And so I'll give you one example. In the upper left-hand corner, that star there is on the Dube Hill, D-U-B. And the Dube Hill, three things happened there, which were of great interest to me from the materials. One, there was a major in the Ulan cavalry of the Prussians who the night before, the Prussians actually did not think that the Austrians had come forward or had stayed to the western portion of the Elbe at all. So they thought they had actually retreated. But a major of the Prussian cavalry went to the Dube Hill and could see watchfires on the hills to the east of him. So where the red line is on that map, the Prussian major saw watchfires. And so that was the first indication that there was actually Austrian army to the west of the Elbe. So that was interesting. So I wanted to see what that was all about. Secondly, Moltke himself walked that ground. So he and the king and Bismarck went to the Dube Hill to assess the situation. So I wanted to walk the ground where Moltke had walked, and that was the spot. So that was the second piece. And third, that was a spot where a shell from the Austrians came across and burst somewhat near the king. And the king turned to Moltke and Bismarck and said, "Gentlemen, that one is on you." I don't know what that means, but that was what he said. And so they immediately moved to a different location. But there's a couple things that was interesting about that. I wanted to see how far an Austrian shell could travel in terms of actually seeing it. I wanted to stand at the place where that happened. And I have three interesting anecdotes from the book that happened at that one star. So I wanted to go there. Each of those stars had multiple stories in that location. So I had mapped out the battlefield in terms of what was interesting to me. Now, if my interest had been logistics and I want to know where all the wagon trains were, and I was very fascinated with wagon trains, I would have gone to a completely different part of the battlefield. And that's the fun part about this as a Kriegspieler. You can take the thing that's interesting to you and map it out. And once you have your map, you might go to a completely different part of the battlefield than I go to or to some of our colleagues go to. So make your own map. I found 6 locations optimal because that was the amount of time I wanted to spend on the battlefield. I had a driver. I had to keep an eye on price, and it all made sense because it was in one area. There are probably on my next visit, should I go back, and I do plan on going back, several other stars I'll add to that to get an additional perspective on the battlefield since I've already visited those 6. So let's talk about surprises. I didn't actually know there was a tower on the battlefield. So I showed up at Chlum. I saw the museum that was closed, and there was a 25-meter tower on the highest point of the battlefield. And for a princely sum of about 75 US cents, I was able to go to the top of that tower by myself. I'm pretty much convinced I'm the only human being that was on the top of that tower that day. And I was able to take video. And because I placed my stars on the map, I could actually face in the cardinal directions of the compass, and I could see the towns, the forests, and all the roads that were on that map. So I had a copy of the map in my hand, and I was literally orienting to the map and looking around. And I could have spent the entire morning up there mapping out the whole battle, but I had a lot of places to see. So already, just right by that surprise of the tower, I had an enormous amount of good, enormous amount of fun just going up in that tower and looking around. So it was a fantastic start to the morning, and I had completed that by like 9:45 in the morning. So surprise number one, already the visit was successful based on the first 45 minutes of the visit. The next thing I did was I wanted to make sure they would go to the obvious places. So if you go to Gettysburg, you want to go to Little Round Top, right? If you go to North Anna, you want to go to the Angle, right, et cetera, right? So each battle has its iconic moment in it, and usually tour guides will take you to those iconic places, the Sunken Road, et cetera. And that's great. I had a chance to visit Waterloo, and I went to Hougoumont, and there's a little basically set up there. They can walk you through it, and there's a little visitor center, done all that stuff, right? So you want to go to the obvious places, but you want to know those are the obvious ones. So in this case, I went to the Sveepwald, which is the Sveep Forest. You see there, it's on this, where this star is, and that's where all the monuments are, because that's where a tremendous amount of fighting had. It was the little round top of the battle, if you will. That's where a lot of fighting went. There was one Prussian division in those woods, and the Austrians sent 2 corps in there trying to unseat them, and they went back and forth all day with a tremendous amount of casualties. So that was an obvious place to go. All the monuments, many of the monuments are there. And in fact, what you see here is a monument to one of the regiments of the 7th Prussian Division. And that takes me to my next point. Monuments become super interesting if you map the battle out. So instead of just seeing these different statues everywhere, you read the monuments, and if you use ChatGPT and have them translate it for you, you can actually pretty quickly get additional information. So this monument, super interesting. This regiment lost 94 soldiers and officers in the battle. And so if you don't really know Prussian order of battle, you'd say, wow, 94, that seems like a lot of losses. But in fact, a Prussian regiment is 3 battalions, and that's 3,000 soldiers. And so it's around 3% was lost in the Sveepwald, where the most intense fighting happened. And in fact, that's about the percentage of the entire Prussian losses for the day. So this was an average amount of losses. Have a nice monument out of it in the Sveepwald, but you can have this kind of context if you've done your homework on the battles. But that's monuments in an obvious place, like the Sveep Forest. So here's the one quick story about a way that the star system can yield some hidden gems. What you see here is a map of Hornhaus, which is a small town, and you see all the red movement and the blue movement was right in the center of the second part of the action when the Prussian Second Army came and hit the Austrians on the flank. The first part was the Austrians moved forward, much to their dismay later on, and then the Prussian Second Army came in. So that town was the very center of this battle, and so I wanted to go there as one of my stars. Just one of the 6. So I had the driver. What I did is I actually used my phone, and I would WhatsApp the driver the location from the map, and then he would drive there. So it was a brilliant little system and very efficient. And he was a great driver and did a great job. A very pleasant day. So we drove there, and we went into this small town, and you couldn't see much from the town itself because it's on a rise, which is part of, if you read Gordon Craig's book, it talks about Hornhauses on a high ground where you could see actually a famous set of 2 linden trees that the Prussian Guard used to actually navigate toward. So we were up on this high ground, but it was now a town with a little bit more modern buildings, not much larger than it was back in the day, but certainly the buildings have been upgraded to a more modern look and feel. So I was in the middle of the square, and he had to find a place to park. And I said, no, I wanted to look north. So I said, I said, stay here, I'll be right back. So I walked down this road, a little farm road, and I reached the edge of a field, and I looked out over this field, and there, as you see here, was the field through which the Prussian Guard came to hit the flank of the Austrians in this area. And so there it was. I was looking at that north end of the line where you just saw on the map, and I just had this eerie moment of picturing what had happened at that spot. So when I was looking up or researching the battle, I was wondering what had happened in this area to the Austrians when they were pinched by the Prussians who were in the Sveepwald, which was slightly to the west of here, the Guards who came down and hit this spot. And as I was standing there, I was standing at the entrance of a little farmlet or a little house. And so I was standing there and I looked down in the bushes and saw this. So this is a monument that was buried back in these bushes. And I'm pretty sure no one had seen it for a very long time because I was standing in a very odd spot. And I used my chat GPT and I looked it up. And it says, in fact, here are buried 12 soldiers of the Austrian 40th Regiment, which is part of the 3rd Corps. And so I knew from my researches that the 3rd Corps had been the corps that had been right at that angle and had been trying to unseat the Prussians in the wood to the west. And they were hit by the Guards. And in fact, here was one monument of 12 soldiers who fell as the Guards hit them at that point. And as I stood there realizing that this is where the action had happened on the battlefield, they had buried the dead very near where they had fallen, that literally I was in the right spot and that to see the action. And I was reminded of a Röchling painting, which I'll show you now, which is of Prussians with their Pickelhaubes coming through the wheat fields. And in fact, I was standing in that painting in my mind for a moment, and it was an eerie and wonderful moment. And it was a hidden gem. And this is what you can get from doing your research, going to a battlefield, laying out your plan a little bit, and knowing what you're doing such that you can find these little moments, whether it's an ancestor in a statue or whether it's a place where the Guards actually attacked. Now, when we look at the whole Königgrätz battlefield and the immense complexity of 180,000, 200,000 per side coming together, there was a whole cavalry engagement to the east. I didn't get a chance to go walk. I could go back to that battlefield 8 to 10 times and still find more little nuggets from this. And so my final piece of advice on two pieces of advice. One is do it. When you go out there and you see the ground versus what you see in a map, it really complements the sensibility that we have as Kriegsspiel umpires. And if you're umpiring or playing and you see a map and you get a sense for terrain, when you stand on that actual terrain, there's something that just comes together in a way that you get it. I would say I highly recommend doing it. And I would highly recommend mapping it out in this way such that you make it personal to yourself. So rather than reading a pamphlet on the Battle of Waterloo, go there and look at the 4 or 5 regiments that are interesting to you, or where the cavalry charged, or where you just things that catch your eye. And don't try to have an exhaustive knowledge of the battle prior to going. Have just enough that you can find 5 or 6 points that are interesting to you, because once you go to the battlefield and you fill in those blanks, you go back and read again, and suddenly the book seems like a completely different experience. So on the way home, I started rereading Gordon Craig's book in portions after I'd visited the battlefield, and suddenly those chapters meant a completely different thing because I'd actually been on the site that he's talking about in the book. I picked up another book, went through that, and suddenly things began to become more clear, and they created more stars, more interesting spots that I wanted to go see. So I go back to the battlefield. So it's a virtual cycle going deep in one of these battlefields. It's immensely rewarding, and I would highly recommend it. So I usually end all of my recordings with my little catchphrase, but it has a different meaning now because when it comes to the battlefields, I want to make sure that I see you out there.